So Eric Jennings is going to speak tonight about his newest book, Escape from Vichy, The Refugee Exodus to the French Caribbean, published by Harvard University Press. We have some copies for sale if you'd like to buy a copy and get a signature on your way out. And Eric is a distinguished professor of the history of France and the Francophone world at the University of Toronto. His areas of research and teaching interests include 19th and 20th century France, French colonialism, decolonization, and the Francophone world. And his previous books include Perspectives on French Colonial Madagascar, Escape from Vichy, The Refugee Exodus to the French Caribbean, Free French Africa in World War II, The African Resistance, and Vichy in the tropics, Cape Town's National Revolution in Madagascar, Guadeloupe, and Indochina, 1940 to 1944. So please join me in welcoming Eric Jennings.
Thanks very much, Jenny, and thank you for having me. It's really delightful to be here as part of several events. The main one having taken place yesterday, it was really an honor to be part of the panel on the new biography on the biography of Vichy. So today I'm going to sort of do a slightly broader focus and talk a little bit about the crisis, the refugee crisis that France faced in 1940, and some of the options that refugees managed to dig up, and the ways in which this particular exodus route, that I think I'm the first one to really stress, is so ambiguous. And without giving too much away, I want to suggest that it's at once an example of rescue and an example of expulsion, as contradictory as those two might seem to us today. So, as I said, I want to set the stage in June 1940. France went from being a country surrounded by either fascist or crypto-fascist states, Franco Spain, Mussolini's Italy, Nazi Germany, to, and one that had incidentally become the foremost host for endangered refugees, be they Spanish Republicans, Italian anti-fascists, anti-Nazi Germans, be they Jewish or communists, or both. To a country that fell in the span of 6 weeks, rather ignominiously, in May and June of 1940. So what happened to the thousands, tens of thousands of refugees who were stranded in France? Well, most obviously they tried to flee the advancing German columns, much as ordinary French civilians, incidentally, were fleeing the advancing columns of the Wehrmacht. But beyond that, as the rhetoric shifted and the new Vichy government was established, these refugees went from being considered by some as sort of economic burden, and here we see parallels to the present in the way that refugees are stigmatized, unfortunately, the world over, to something quite different. They went from being seen as parasites, for lack of a better word, to the cause of France's defeat, kind of fifth column that was responsible. Now this is all the more absurd and ironic, given that some of these people had been in the vanguard of fighting Hitler up until 1933, then fled Germany as a last resort, but that was very much the perception. So here you have France carved into two, and the bluish zone was the so-called unoccupied or so-called free zone with the capital of Vichy, and obviously the major port city of Marseille to the south, which I'll be talking about. The north had a constant Nazi presence as of June 1940. Now, let me qualify that. The Vichy regime was born of the armistice of June 1940, again an ignominious armistice, which had as one of its clauses a surrender on demand clause, whereby the Nazis could ask for any German or Austrian national to be returned to them on demand, and Vichy by law was obliged to do so. And this is going to come up several times in my talk. So Vichy grappled with the refugee crisis in a number of ways, and I want to stress here that the camps that it set up in the unoccupied zone were not extermination camps. These were transit camps, and most of these camps actually had existed already in the 30s. A great many of them, in fact, had been set up around the time of the Spanish Civil War as a way of sheltering, giving lodging to Spanish Republicans who had fled over the Pyrenees after the defeat of the Republic at the hands of Franco. These camps were going to change functions quite rapidly. And there's a network of camps across the southern zone, places like Ménil, Gurs, Rive-Sage. They don't have time to get into each one. they all had different profiles and they changed over time. So some were predominantly Jewish camps, others were predominantly female camps like Rieux, and so on and so forth. Another one was predominantly a Roma camp. All of these were the bête noire of the Vichy regime in different ways. But their function changed over time as well. They went from being a place like Ménil that you're looking at here. Well, first and foremost, it was a tile factory. Then it became a sorting camp, a sort of transit camp in the late 30s for refugees. A great many German refugees were already housed here before the fall of France. And up until the middle of 1941, it was still possible to leave this camp if you had immigration papers and if you could show that a country somewhere else, be it China or the United States or Cuba or Mexico, was willing to receive. All of this would change quite dramatically in 1942 when the gates of these camps shut and when they became literally antechambers to Auschwitz. So this is a chronologically sensitive story, and what I'm going to be talking about is a brief window between basically June of 1940 and May of 1941, during which escape was still possible. It's very delicate talking about this window because I don't want to surmise that the Holocaust was happening before it happened or that there's a straight line, a teleology towards the Holocaust. But I also don't want to deny, if you've read Anna Zegel's Transit, for instance, the climate of extreme fear. The people in Varian Fry's office, Varian Fry being the American who was tasked with rescuing intellectuals and artists, the people who literally had strokes or heart attacks in his office because of the anxiety that they had of being handed over on demand to the Nazis. So part of the story here is that of the rescue of artists and intellectuals. Not all of them escaped via Martinique. Some of them escaped via other channels, including Lisbon. That was another major channel. Some went to Shanghai, which is something that's been written about quite a bit in the last 20 years. And here you have a drawing by Max Ernst in 1939 from Ménil. And here you have essentially refugees, and it's titled the Stateless. Sorry, the German terms escape my mind, but anyway, it's titled the Stateless. You have refugees reduced to the state of files, metal files. So desperate is their desire to escape the camp. And this is prior to the advent of Vichy. Post-Vichy, obviously conditions become a lot harsher. As I mentioned, people went from being inmates to essentially prisoners. And this is a view of a wall painting in the refectory of Ménil showing what I consider to be sort of dual fantasies. Fantasies of gastronomic plenty and fantasies of escape to a tropical setting. Now there's other things happening here as well. This mural has been attributed to the Jewish painter Karl Bodek, who tragically would die later at Auschwitz. And there's obviously, sort of Jewish nutritional references and restrictions here with the ham in the shape of a ship as well. All of this to say that in these camps, and especially at Ménil, from which escape to the Western Hemisphere was still possible, there are these networks that are in place, and there are also multiple discussions and fantasies of leaving, of decamping by any way possible. So this is a song that was performed at Gurs in 1941. I'm not going to sing it for you, but just a few verses. Connaissez-vous les Antilles, c'est là qu'il faut vivre en famille. Quel est l'objet de vos rêves, le paradis? La Martinique, où boit-on le rhum comme du lait? À quoi rêve Cohen comme Muller? Où veulent-ils tous aller? Oh, la Martinique. So do you know the Antilles? That's where we should live as a family. What is the object of all your dreams? Paradise, Martinique. Where does one drink rum like milk? What do the Cohens and the Mullers dream of? Oh, Martinique. So clearly, Martinique is on people's radar screen from within the campus. And sometimes it's far more amorphous, a fantasy of getting out of Dodge. This is a drawing by the Czech artist Alan Divic, who would indeed be on board the Paul Le Merle, along with so many other major figures in 1941. This is a drawing that he initially carved on the walls of La Santé, or at least he found inspiration in prisoners' graffitis on the walls of the Santé prison in Paris for this particular sketch. You see lots of things going on here. To my mind, it speaks to the idea of decamping to the colonies, but also of the colonies as a kind of penal colony. Thinking of Dreyfus, the year 1894, here is the year of his conviction, the possibility of death, all of this wrapped up rather ambiguously into a single project. Okay, so what is the genesis of the Martinique escape group? This is something I struggled with when I first began really expressing interest in this history in the late 90s. This is a document I found a few yards from here at the Butler Library at Columbia University. So it's a telegram that American humanitarian Varian Fry sent out to some of the major philanthropists who are funding it. And it's quite interesting because he speaks to what he considers to be, quote, the best avenue of escape. So I'll let you read it. Break now imminent between Vichy and Washington means end of hope of escape for 300 men and women, anti-Nazis, all European nationalities wanted by the Gestapo, now in possession of complete emigration papers and awaiting evacuation from Marseille. We fear momentarily an announcement of a Vichy decree interrupting the Marseille to Martinique shipping line, thus cutting the best avenue of escape. And this is precisely what happened, except it wasn't by Vichy decree, it was because the last cargo ship, the Winnipeg, was intercepted on the high seas by the Allied Navy. So the point here is that Varian Fry knew that this was the best avenue of escape, and he talks about it in his memoirs. This is a very short excerpt from his outstanding memoirs titled Surrender on Demand. It was the ships to Martinique which really kept us busy. We couldn't have thought up anything better if we had the power to arrange the route ourselves. They not only eliminated the trouble with the transit visas, they also removed the danger of the trip through Spain, for they went directly from Marseille to Martinique, and from there it was possible to go straight to New York. They were almost as good as the much advertised but never realized rescue ship which was to have gone to Marseille to take refugees directly to New York. So clearly, to Varian Fry, this is an opportunity that he was able to exploit. He put probably over 1,000 refugees on these boats to Martinique. But he himself didn't know why these boats were leaving. And this is what really started to fascinate me. And I found the key to the mystery that only made things actually more mysterious in the archives of the French colonial ministry in Aix-en-Provence, in the form of a letter written by one of Vichy's first early ministers, product, if you will, of an early Vichy, Interior Minister Marcel Péroton. And Péroton had the particularity of having had a colonial upbringing. He had lived for years in Martinique, actually, as a young man. He had served in Tunisia, so he had all of these colonial contacts, and I think that's important. He also was close to the radical centrist party in France. He was not sort of as wildly radical as some of the people who had come into Vichy a year later. He was a product, if you will, of this early Vichy. What fascinated me about these instructions is how, for lack of a better word, how schizophrenic they are. They are at once couched in humanitarian discourse and a discourse of exclusion. And to Péroton, this was not a contradiction. Let me just read you a key passage from his instructions of November 29, 1940, which really opened up the Martinique route to thousands of refugees. I have the honor of informing you that I'm considering practicing a policy of massive emigrations of foreigners who are overrepresented in the French nation and economy, taking their fill of consumer goods without producing any themselves, sometimes suffering from the rigorous treatment that has by necessity been imposed on them. Such foreigners cannot remain in this current limbo. A sense of social responsibility, a concern that we not falter on the rules of humanity, give us an imperious obligation urgently to arrange the departure of the greatest number of them to warmer climes. I have the honor of asking you, given the urgency before us, for the aforementioned reasons to distance these people from the metropole, i.e. mainland France, whether it would be possible to direct a certain number of them to the French Caribbean. The stay of said foreigners would be temporary in nature and motivated purely by the exceptional circumstances through which we are living. I should preface this by saying that Péroton had first tried the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, saying, try the US, try Canada, try Cuba, try Mexico, try the Dominican Republic. basically fin de non-recevoir. Nobody was interested. And so it was really as a last resort, and Vicki Karen talks about this really well in her book on the refugee crisis. It was really as a last resort that Pérouton thought of the French colonies. Why? Well, from a sort of legal standpoint, it was pretty obvious. If you were a foreigner legally residing in France in 1940-41, there was no reason you couldn't legally reside in Martinique because Martinique was and is part of France. So it was a kind of outlet that didn't necessarily involve having permission from these other countries. However, as it happens, the refugees who would go to Martinique would invariably, with only a handful of exceptions, move on. They bounce on to Mexico, to the Dominican Republic, to Cuba, to Argentina, to the US, to Canada, etc., etc. So it was a kind of hybrid solution, a fallback solution, if you will, but it's one that was practiced on a large scale. And I had a couple of eureka moments in the archives. The first one I just showed you, it's sort of, aha, now I'm starting to understand this. It is at once expulsion and rescue. The other eureka moment came in the Naval Archives Annex in Toulon, where I finally got hold of a list of all the cargo ships that were headed to Martinique. So these were not passenger liners. This wasn't the Titanic. This wasn't, Carnival Cruise Line. These were quite grim cargo mixed. So they were freighters that had a few cabins on board. And I'll show you some pictures of the inside of the freighter taken by the refugees themselves. But the point here is that this is a heck of a lot of vessels having navigated between Vichy and Fort-de-France Martinique between the fall of France and the end of the route in June of 1941. And I estimate that there were about 5,000 refugees on board these boats. For some of the boats, I have precise numbers. For others, I have just deductions or impressions from passengers on board. So hence the lack of a very precise figure. Only in a couple of instances do I have full passenger manifests, unfortunately. So how did you get on board the boats? This is a question I actually asked Claude Lévi-Strauss in a letter in 1997 saying, listen, your memoirs are wonderful, but they're very vague about how you actually found your way on board. Did somebody alert you to it? There were certainly various networks. Varian Fraud got people on board. He wasn't alone. There was a senator from the Caribbean who also got people on board, pretending that they would be working for him for, a pineapple juice enterprise in Guadeloupe. There were various schemes to get people on board. There were also very enterprising people who just found out about it. And if you look at the German Jewish emigre press, you find this. This is from the New York German language newspaper Ausbau, showing an advertisement. We're in May 41, so precisely, tragically, as the route was actually closing, but they didn't know that, advertising the Marseille to Martinique route. So there was also transatlantic dialogue. Family members in New York and elsewhere getting in touch with their relatives stranded in Marseille, paying for their way, and of course signing affidavits. Because the other part of this story is how hard it was to get to the Western Hemisphere, getting harder month by month. Initially, you needed one US signed affidavit. By 1941, you needed two, and it was increasingly hard to enter the United States. And of course, this climate of panic, of anxiety, is brilliantly detailed and chronicled by Anna Segal in Transit. So this is from the New York Review of Books translation from 2013, obviously a semi-autobiographical novel, but this passage seems quite evocative to me. My visa hasn't arrived yet. The little official assured me it was just a question of days, but the departure of the Port de Mer is also a matter of days. Now they're saying at the Martinique shipping line that the ships will be leaving sooner than scheduled because of a special government order. The little Mexican consular official was very polite. Actually, he was more than just polite. You probably know him too, since you go there often. He's a strange little devil. At every other consulate, they make you feel like you're nothing, a nobody. The consuls all talk as if they were talking to a nobody with a phantom dossier. So people were staking their bets on 4 or 5 different routes. They were lining up at the Mexican consulate. You'd bump into the same person over at the US consulate. You'd bump into the same person at Varian Fry's offices in Marseille. So how did you get on board? Well, it's a combination of things. Luck, networks, what the French call débrouillardise, wherewithal, resilience, but also just flat out luck, right? So This is Jacques René, also known as Raymond Assayas, his real name, a French filmmaker, father of Olivier Assayas, a modern-day filmmaker, who describes precisely how he got on board. One leaves any way one can. Between France and Martinique, it's done by cargo ship. One such cargo ship is about to leave for Martinique. Take it or leave it. There are 10 would-be candidates for every spot on board, so long live the cargo. He also relates his parting experience, quote, "The police officer handed me my passport with its exit visa. He was smiling. Every day he saw gloomy lines of people hoping for a favorable answer. The answer was always no. For me, it was yes." Why? Luck, chance, resourcefulness. In any event, I was leaving. So very little, actually, distinguishes a successful file from an unsuccessful. Hard as a historian to come to terms with this, but I gradually did. I want to focus now on the case of German Jewish poet Walter Mering. Mering has some really quite wonderful details, both in his published work and in his notes in the Emergency Rescue Committee archive, some of which are here at Columbia, others of which are in Washington, D.C. at the Holocaust Museum, and others of which are actually in Albany, New York, and I consulted all three to get this picture. So at the Arles prefecture, Mering was told by, quote, "the old lady of the Bureau des Passeports," that I must try to find a place on board the ship for Martinique, and she gave me a special visa for Martinique beside the Vichy visa. He also seems to have received assistance from a bureaucrat in Marseille. The Emergency Rescue Committee archives contain an original handwritten note from Mering to Fry on Marseille Hotel letterhead, dated February 3rd, 1941. Reads in somewhat broken English, quote, "I have seen once more Madame Esmiol at the prefecture. She has changed my visa de sortie for the Antilles. I have got it already." So he gives a name, and I was able to dig into the Marseille architectures, and I did find an Esmiol spelled the way that he spelled it, but it's not a very common last name, and Esmiol, without the L-E, is. And there is indeed an Anna Esmiol, whose picture you see here, who was born in 1892, and who was clearly helping at least one of the refugees. So armed with this information, I went to somebody I knew had been on one of the boats, the son of Anne Segers, Pierre Advani, and I asked him if this could be the same bureaucrat his mother talked about in transit. And he said, "There's a good chance, although the woman we dealt with was a little pudgier." And then I went back to the record and realized this picture would have been 10 years old. It was actually from, so I still don't know if Madame Esmiol was the sort of guardian angel who helped all of these people out. But she certainly helped out Walter Mering, that much I know for sure. And Mering didn't just get the complicity of Esmiol. There's another incredible example of complicity that he talks about in his own writings, and that then Varian Fry picks up in Surrender on Demand. As he prepared to board the Martinique-bound Wyoming, one of the many cargo ships, the police looked over Mering's papers. Mering explains, quote, "Examining my papers, the chief of police took out of the shelf a card so that I could read it. And the card ran, quote, Walter Mering, interdit de sortir de France, décision de la Kundt Commission." So, Walter Mering banned from leaving France by decision of the Kundt Commission. The Kundt Commission was the Nazi commission in charge of applying the Surrender on Demand clause, and their lists changed regularly, constantly updated. Varian Fry was always bribing officials to get the updated list. So, this official is showing Mering the list, the document, that says, "You're not allowed to leave France." Whereupon, the official called the prefecture, and 10 minutes later he gave me back my papers and said, smiling, "C'est peut-être un autre Walter Mering, partez." Maybe it's another Walter Mering, get out. And I see many such cases in the area. So again, is this an application? So is this police officer and our Madame Esmiol both sort of taking individual initiative, or are they just in line with the Pérouton measures, right? And these are the sorts of questions that I ask in the book. In some cases, I sort of hint at my answer, but I don't want to provide a definitive answer because it seems to me that this ambiguity, that incidentally you also see in Transit by Anne Segers, this ambiguity is absolutely key. And it gets all the more complicated because although Mering was thrilled to leave, he did a little jig when he got the news that he was going, he also firmly believed that he'd been expelled. And this is from another archive in Germany, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Bonn. Quote, Although he perceived the irony of this, Mary didn't necessarily view the two logics as contradictory. He evoked having to turn in all of his existing paperwork in Marseille, his carte de séjour request, even a fake passport with a visa for the Belgian Congo, in exchange for, quote, a little slip of paper with a number in blue ink, purple stamp of the Sûreté Nationale, and a machine-typed visa, quote, valid for one departure. He then writes of boarding the Wyoming with, quote, the soggy papier de refoulement on me, an expulsion that was the object of jealousy of thousands. He added, it's true, I almost envied myself the chance of being expelled. So again, it's both. It is at once a rescue operation and an expulsion. In the past, the rules of humanity had mandated that people be welcomed in France. Now, in the reading of Breton, it mandated that people be thrown out. Where it gets complicated is that the same logic of throwing people out is what's going to lead in 1942 to handing people over to the Germans, right? So again, chronology matters deeply in this instance. I'll give you another example, just in case you don't believe me on the fact that this is an expulsion. So this is a document from the Exil archives in Frankfurt, showing the fate of an Austrian Jewish union leader by the name of Herod Christhaber. And the Montauban prefecture, the original document's on the right here, I don't know if you can see it, the original document includes the following line: I have the honor of informing you that in view of an imminent collective departure of emigrants, you are to be sent to Martinique with your family. Please present yourself at the Montauban train station on February 25th at 11 a.m. An escort will await you, holding your passport and your exit visa. In other words, he's being escorted onto the boats, right? They hold the passport. He doesn't have it with him the way I do. He is literally being told, get out of here. But again, thrilled to leave. So, people were being directed to Martinique, but I also don't want to restrict their agency. Others were also finding their way on board. And here at the New York Public Library, you have a wonderfully rich correspondence between Erich Itor Kahn and his wife, Frieda Kahn. These were two German-Jewish musicians, Erich Itor Kahn, quite a renowned pianist, and they were separated by virtue of Vichy's treatment of foreigners. Erich was interned in one of the many camps in the southern zone. Frieda was in a hotel in Fréjus. The fact that they were interned, that they were separated, is very useful to the historian because they had to write to each other. And what we have at the New York Public Library is their really quite tender and touching correspondence to each other, but also, from my standpoint, they're ranking the opportunities of escape. And one day, there's a mirage that appears. Oh my God, we're going to get to go. Our New York lawyer tells us that we're going to be able to go through the U.S. Virgin Islands. Next day, that mirage closes. So it's one unexpected opening after another, one disappointment after another, exactly like the disappointments that Jacques Chiffrin talks about in his correspondence with André. But what's so interesting to me is this dialogue between the couple about what is the safest bet, what should they do. So on April 17th, Frieda wrote to Erich, and that's the letter that you have right here. First of all, it's fascinating that they're writing to each other in French. French was actually Frieda's third language after Russian and German. It was definitely Erich's second language. So why are they writing to each other in French? Have they disavowed German because of the Nazis? Do they believe that their letter is going to be read by Vichy censorship and anyway, so they might as well make it easy for them? Maybe a little bit of both. These are the two hypotheses that I came up with. So Frieda wrote to Erich, and her tone was more frantic than usual. We can no longer hesitate, and we must leave as soon as possible by any available route. She'd also received advice from Varian Fry's team. They told her that it would be easy to change route. One was not at all locked into the Lisbon Channel. That very day, Erich responded. He worried of Frieda's sudden desire to change plans and jettison the Iberian Channel, i.e. Lisbon, altogether for the Martinique corridor. He noted that the Martinique option presented drawbacks of its own. A long wait over there seems inevitable, he wrote. The pianist had been rightly informed that foreign migrants were also held in camps on Martinique when they arrived. He reasoned, naturally we must leave as soon as possible, but is there a point in swapping Martinique for Goose? And here Frida and Eric's approaches radically differ. She did see a difference between being a prisoner in the French Caribbean versus a prisoner in Guyos, and she carried the day. And of course she was quite right, because Guyos was going to turn into one of the many antechambers of Drancy, which itself became an antechamber of Auschwitz, whereas the refugees who got to Martinique, none of them were sent back. A handful of them died on location of disease, but that was the very worst thing that happened to any of them. They almost all managed to bounce on to Mexico, the US, Argentina, Canada, etc. So I want to say a few words about the route itself. And I'm very lucky as a historian because there were so many photographers on board. So we have some really wonderful photographs. This is by the famous German Jewish photographer Joseph Breitenbach. His papers are held in Tucson, Arizona. And you have his picture on board. And you can actually see the transats, the sort of the chairs that are unfolded here. But again, it's not a passenger liner. You can actually make out in the original somebody trying to smoke a cigarette behind this. The conditions on board were not exactly those of a pleasure cruise. We also have the written testimony of some of the passengers, which is fascinating. So, according to filmmaker Jacques Remy, i.e. Raymond Assayas, quote, "The deck belongs to everyone." That was his original hope. However, he promptly realized that, quote, "Instinctively people immediately formed into groups according to tastes, tendencies, and origins. Despite sharing the soot, the terrible food, the experience of exile, they still recreated all of the divisions, be they class or political differences that they'd experienced back home. Differences have surfaced," he wrote, "just as they do on shore. His verdict was unequivocal. Even for an instant, a community of equals has proven impossible." And so Victor Serge, the revolutionary and former companion of Trotsky, former anarchist, would say much the same thing. He talks about how they actually recreated the divisions of Paris. There was a Montmartre, there was a Belleville, and Serge has this incredible anecdote of trying to mingle, but it doesn't quite work. He goes up to a wealthy diamond cutter from Antwerp and tries to strike up a conversation, and the Antwerp diamond cutter tells him about his business, and then says, "And what do you do?" And Victor Serge says, "Well, I'm a former pal of Trotsky's," and then the conversation kind of died on the spot. Again, the passengers really talk a great deal about their experience, but also about the particular mix of people on board. There are children, there's men, there's people of all nationalities, Eastern European Jewish people, Spanish anti-republicans, Italian anti-fascists, French communists, all of these people on board. Here's what Victor Serge has to say. "We arrived in Martinique in the last days of April 1941. Us, that is to say, 300 refugees from Europe. A little over 2/3 of them reduced to fleeing the old continent only because they belonged to the people who gave the world Christ, Spinoza, Marx, and Freud, the Jews. Many reactionaries among them, incidentally. A little under 100 revolutionaries filled with the memories of their grand struggles and all their defeats, full of hope nonetheless. Heroic defenders of Madrid, etc. So he sees this as the sort of vanguard of the European left heading overseas. Other people have quite different reactions, and it's fascinating to see how some evoke the Pilgrims, others talk about Columbus, others still talk about the slave trade. There's all of these references that are being conjured up as they cross the Atlantic. Again, this was no luxury passenger liner, right? So there's the story of the two Rudolf Hilferding and Rudolf Breitscheid, two leading members of the Weimar Republic who were supposed to get out via Martinique, and indeed they had been on the Kund Commission list, but they were talked out of boarding the Martinique line because they were told, "Oh, you two gentlemen do not belong in third-class cabins, and that's all we have left." And tragically, they were handed over by Vichy the very next day after not going, so to the Nazis, and were both killed. One almost immediately, the other died near the end of the war. All of this to say that these twists of fate hinged on very little, and that conditions on board were not very luxurious. This is a picture taken by a dissident Czech communist photographer and artist, Antonín Pelč, who's known for his satire and for his caricatures. You can see that this is not a very luxurious passenger liner, it's a cargo ship. Here are the makeshift women's latrines on board, with refugees in the foreground doing their laundry. How long do you think it would take to go from Marseille to Martinique on a cargo ship? Any guesses?
2 weeks.
It took most of the boats a month. They would zigzag to avoid German U-boats. They would spend 5 days in transit in places like Casablanca, and in some instances Dakar as well. They would stay as close to the coast as possible. They were utterly paranoid that they would be sunk either by a German U-boat or accosted by the British Navy. So being a Vichy liner or a Vichy cargo ship entailed all sorts of risks of its own. So life continued on board. This is the wonderful photo by Dinah Lowenstein showing, well, I know because the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Archives has this lovely thing with Post-its. I know who's on board. You've got Victor Serge on the far left. You've got the wonderful Afro-Cuban painter Wilfredo Lam foregrounded here as well. The Bart family, etc., posing for a photograph. I mentioned there were great photographers on board. There's a wonderful cutting-edge surrealist photographer, Ilse Bing, on board the Winnipeg. These are her pictures of leaving Marseille in 1941, and you see the refugees ready to board. And I just want to close with what happens to them on location. I mentioned that this was an ambiguous exile. They weren't exactly greeted with open arms. Anybody who's read Fils de Tropique by Claude Lévi-Strauss knows that they were essentially greeted with a kick in the pants by the Martinique authorities, who saw them as traitors. André Breton, who had fought the war of 1914 and 1918, was essentially called a traitor for leaving France. And this was the document that customs officials in Martinique were given. They were to ask passengers if they'd ever been condemned for a crime, how much money they had with them, had they ever been revolutionaries, have you ever participated in a political activity? André Breton was told in no uncertain terms, do what you want while you're here, but don't strike up conversations with black people. So it was a fairly tense climate. He did not listen and struck up a wonderful friendship with Aimé Césaire and with Suzanne Césaire. These were same instructions about what was to happen to people. So nominally, if you were a foreigner, you were to be interned in one of the two camps. Again, these are basically refugee camps. They didn't have barbed wire around them. It was possible to escape, but where would you go? You were on an island, and conditions in the camps were not exactly delightful. There were lice, there weren't enough latrines, but it was the safety of the Western Hemisphere. So there's ambiguity here as well. French citizens were allowed to stay in hotels in town, so again, passengers were divided. Here are a couple of records from Jacques Rémy, or Raymond Assayas. He was busy in town as a French national. He avoided the Lazaret camp, but he went to the religious authorities in Martinique and got a fake baptismal certificate. He was Jewish, but he thought this would help him to enter Argentina. So everybody was still thinking about the next stage of their journey. And this may be a reason why the Martinique escape route hasn't drawn attention. People have always thought of it as just a stopover. And some of the refugees stayed there 3 weeks, some of them stayed there a year, but invariably they bounced on. None of them actually set route. None of the 5,000 or 6,000 actually stayed in Martinique. Cameras weren't allowed inside the Lazaret camp, but at least 2 people disobeyed those orders. One of them was the cutting-edge German communist photographer Germaine Kohl, who, just like the Khans, by the way, stopped speaking German altogether and switched to French. And Germaine Kohl took some quite wonderful photographs inside the camp, as did Antonin Pelch, whom I talked about earlier. So here you have a picture by Kohl showing, amongst other people, Vlad Serge, the son of Victor Serge, Jacques Rémy, and so on. Another Germaine Kohl picture showing the inmates lining up for water, and a drawing by Antonin Pelch showing one of the buildings of the camp. I want to close on this sort of unexpected synergy that would take place between some of the surrealist exiles and the apostles of Negritude, who were the Césaires. So you have this incredible opportunity with these great intellectuals and painters and artists on board, and these local artists who are also articulating their own vision of celebrating blackness, of negritude at this very time. And you see this synergy at work in art. So this is one of the many sketches by André Masson. Masson was on board the boat, although he was French. He'd taken the Spanish Republican cause. He'd done some quite terrifying caricatures of Hitler. And his wife was Jewish, and his son was therefore considered half Jewish by the authorities, so he had various reasons to leave. This is one of Masson's drawings in which he is clearly eroticizing Martinique. Another Masson sketch showing Martinique's volcanic sort of heaving in a very surrealist way. Others change registers altogether. German communist refugee Karl Heidenreich had been a sort of abstract painter, and then he arrived in Martinique, and all of a sudden he did these lovely pastels, almost as if he'd found new life and lost the kind of darkness that he'd experienced in Europe. And one of the most famous artistic refugees of all was Wilfredo Lam, who had left, first of all, the Republican side, fought for after they were defeated. He fled over to France, and from there he managed to get on the Pôle de Mer to Martinique. From Martinique he managed to get back to Cuba. I know from his correspondence with André Breton at the Bibliothèque Jacques Rousset in Paris, and his correspondence with Aimé Césaire, and I know you consulted the same library, just how important his Martinique moment was, because the Césaires exposed him to wonderful forest and valley, the verdant valley of Absalon, whereby, Lam's own reckoning, he found some of the inspiration for his masterpiece, The Jungle, which you can see right here in New York City at the moment. So The Jungle is obviously a dialogue of many things, but I am persuaded that his synergy with the Césaires and his hikes in the Absalon Valley have, in some ways, colored this masterpiece. I'm going to leave it there. Perhaps one last thing I want to suggest is the final ambiguity of this route is that it ends in May-June 1941 because of American paranoia over what's going on in Martinique. Martinique was ruled by Vichy. Otherwise, if it had been a Gaullist colony, these refugees would have never gone there. There wouldn't have been a shipping line. And you could read in the Washington Post, quote, Gestapo rules Martinique. And Life magazine ran a special issue in which they said, you know, Martinique's chief import these days are Gestapo agents posing as refugees. This idea that the ships were bringing in sort of lamb, wolves in sheep's clothing was eventually what did it, the Martinique route, because the Americans send out orders to intercept one of the vessels, which is intercepted by the Dutch Navy in May-June 1941. The passengers are all searched, all interrogated. They are eventually let go. There are no spies found on board whatsoever, but the damage has been done. And Vichy certainly protests the seizure of this ship, the Winnipeg. And then following ships are stuck in this horrible limbo, including the Wyoming, on which Chiffon found himself, which was then stranded in Casablanca, where once again, Berg and Fry and other organizations come to the rescue. Thank you very much. So we have time for questions. I think we have 15 minutes by my watch.
Yes, you said that the Vichy ran Martinique during the German occupation of France. What happened to the, who ran the other colonies, like Guadeloupe, French Oceania, etc.?
Yeah, so the story of France's colonies in World War II is a complicated one. It's really the story of a pan-imperial civil war. From the get-go, General de Gaulle wants colonies to go over to his side. His famous Appel du 18 Juin 1940 is as much about getting colonies to side with him as it is individual French people. Almost nobody answers him immediately. The first colony to go over to his cause in the summer of 1940 are the tiny New Hebrides, modern-day Vanuatu. But then the big chunk that goes over to him in August 1940, that was the subject of one of my books, was Equatorial Africa and Cameroon. And I argue in that book, called Free French Africa in World War II, that we have to really look long and hard at who made up the Free French ranks, because to me, 1/3 of all Free French forces were black and African. So we have to sort of revise our understanding of what your typical French resistance member looked like in 1941. Martinique and Guadeloupe stayed under Vichy's boot until the summer of 1943. Vichy lost one colony after another. So the first ones that it lost were Free French Africa, so Equatorial Africa and Cameroon. Then in December of 1941, they lost Saint-Pierre-and-Miquelon, they lost Syria. By 1942, they lost, by the end of 1942, they lost North Africa. By 1943, West Africa. Late 1942, Madagascar. The last colony to remain loyal to Vichy, the inhabitants never had a say. It was the government who decided. The last colony to remain loyal to Vichy was Indochina, which remained in Vichy's orbit even after Vichy ceased to exist in France. Astonishing. So it's a story of one colony going over to the Free French after another. I know from the archives that the vast majority of the population of Martinique and Guadeloupe wanted nothing to do with Vichy. They violently opposed them. And roughly 5,000 Martiniquais and Guadeloupeans left on board tiny boats for the neighboring British islands of Dominica and St. Lucia to join the fighting French, a rate per capita that is far superior to that of mainland France, if you look at the number of people who joined the fighting French. So that's the other part of the story.
Can you clarify the history of the Vichy part of France? Because it sounded like Vichy was established before the Germans were involved in the country of France.
No, no. So Vichy comes about after the defeat of June 1940. Vichy is it's a spa town before then, but the regime is born in the summer of 1940, in July of 1940, out of the ashes of the defeat, when Marshal Philippe Pétain, the elderly savior of France in World War I, is given full powers by the French National Assembly, convened at a casino at Vichy because the nation has crumbled. And it's easy to scoff at this in retrospect, but people's worldview had collapsed. France was supposed to have the strongest military in Europe. It fell in 6 weeks. This stoked conspiracy theories. We have conspiracy theories today, and it stoked conspiracy theories then, that for France to have fallen so quickly, it couldn't have been a military catastrophe. It had to be something else. France had to be rotten from within, and all the Germans had to do was push the rotting door. So who was the rot? Well, to some the rot was the communists, to others it was the Jews, to others it was the Freemasons, to others it was homosexuals, it was people who had sabotaged France's birth rate, but it all begins with the defeat. What I was suggesting, though, was that the camps, so Vichy is born in July 1940, but the camps, the infrastructures, the people, they don't just arrive overnight. So Vichy used pre-existing installations. So these camp facilities in the southern zone had been used by the Republic to house inmates. So places like exiles had been set up. Well, you can see it's right on the border with Spain to bring in the Spanish Republicans in the 30s. Other camps changed functions over time. I mentioned that Liaco was a female-only camp. Gurs became one of the main camps for Jewish people in the south. But so the buildings pre-existed Vichy for the most part. Some of them had actually been built by inmates in the 30s, the inmates themselves. And these camps were pretty squalid. You know, I looked at the Red Cross reports out of Switzerland. People were suffering from what the French call cachexie, malnourishment. It was estimated that half of people couldn't stand for more than half an hour without collapsing. Malnourishment was chronic. So conditions were grim in these camps.
You mentioned the name Varian Fry. Now, he'd been a volunteer to help these refugees. Who are the other agencies that offered this transportation or this way out to these people? And do they have to pay? I mean, what were the arrangements?
These are very good questions. Okay, so first of all, the point I'm trying to make is that none of these wonderful agencies are responsible for the route itself. That the Vichy government wanted to keep the route open. There's another reason why they did, and I didn't get to talk about it. They wanted to keep a lifeline to their colonies. The ships that were going there came back full of rum, sugar, bananas, right? So there was that reason as well. The organizations were critical middlemen, getting people the funds to take the votes, and getting people to find the votes, in matching them. And the cost of these crossings was astronomical. I mentioned yesterday, between 5 and 10 times higher than a luxury cruise would have been prior to the war. So there were also deposits. You needed to put down a huge, I can't remember the figure, it's in my book, but a huge deposit to guarantee that you weren't going to become a burden on the state in Martinique. So it was de facto people who were very well connected through organizations like Varied Fries, or the Quakers, or the Joint Distribution Committee, or the Red Cross. Any number of these organizations was helping people. Or people who were celebrities, or people who were wealthy enough to have the funds themselves. So this is not a self-selecting group, but it is an elite group of exiles. And this is something that, I had to come to terms with. And I mentioned yesterday that on board one of the boats, I had a photographer who had photographed 2 people who were on 2 of the other boats. And I wondered, how could this be such a small coterie? How could these people all know each other? And the answer, of course, is that they were a small elite coterie of exiles who'd known each other before in Berlin and elsewhere. Does this make it any more, who am I to decide who should have gotten out? Obviously, that's not the historian's job. But it is an important observation, that you needed to know someone. And in the book, I give the examples of people who were often upper middle class, who had contacts in New York and still couldn't get out. So that then, brings in the other factors that I mentioned: luck, happenstance, wherewithal, resourcefulness. And I mentioned, the 2 politicians who had an opportunity to get out and wanted a big business class ticket and didn't get out. There's also cases of, near misses in the other direction. So Walter Merritt could have been apprehended any number of times, and he got the ticket that had belonged to one of the 2 politicians. He got their very bunk. So there is this kind of very, as I said, it hinges on very little who got out versus who didn't get out.
I wonder what you thought of the film Transit, if it was faithful to the situation.
Another good question. I was just commenting on the film Transit for its opening at a festival in Washington, D.C. about a month ago. And I'm of 2 minds. On the one hand, Transit, the film, does a wonderful job of drawing parallels with the present, with all of the ethical conundrums that we face today and all of the horrible politics and fear-mongering around refugees, which is something I'm trying to do with my book as well. But I'd like to think I don't hit people over the head with the argument quite so much. The problem with the film is that in bringing it so wonderfully to the present, and it's so jarring to see modern-day French police officers doing the shake-ups, doing the roundups that are described by Anna Sagans. And of course the refugees themselves, those in danger, are now North African rather than being Jewish. There's all of these wonderful twists. The problem with it is that it's at the expense of all the stuff I've just described, which is to say, the queues at the consulates, yes, but you've lost the context of France falling, you've lost the context of the 2 zones, you've lost all of the specificities of the Second World War. So at the end of the day, as a historian, I couldn't help but find that unfortunate. But I don't think that's a fair reading. I think it's a fantastic adaptation. And it's really well worth seeing if you haven't seen it. But again, I know why the people are queuing at the Mexican and US consulates, but you have to go back to the original to understand. You have to go back to the novel to understand why if you're just seeing the film. Yes?
You mentioned Riversat. I know it has been restored, renovated, and opened as a museum. Have you visited it, and do you recommend it?
I haven't been to the Riversat one. I've been to the museum that was made at Ménil, and it is very powerful, very well done. And again, Ménil was a very curious place because of all the camps. It was deliberately chosen near Marseille because of the proximity of the Mexican and US consulates in Marseille to get people out. And then overnight, as I describe in my book, the gates closed by order of Vichy. So people who could have gotten out one week simply could no longer the week following, and instead of being on a ship to safety in Shanghai or Martinique or Lisbon or wherever, deportation awaited them. And there, the terrible twist of fate that I've been describing really became chronological. In the span of a day, the fate of people changes. So no, I think it's well done. I think, again, it's a very presentist reading about never again. We need to learn lessons from this, and why not? The pictures that I took of Ménil were before it became the memorial that it is today, so I actually can't remember what happened to that refectory painting that I showed you with the fantasy of abundance and of escape.
And if there is no other question, you said you would sing the song, but you have the sheet music?
No, I don't.
I'm a musician.
And I also can't sing. So.
Do you think there will be any information now that the Vatican archives will be open about any of this?
So I was very curious to know about that baptismal certificate that I showed you, right? And so I went to the Vatican's archives, but obviously they were closed and there was nothing to be done. But, you know, that particular subplot would have been something, I'm guessing, that would have pleased the Vatican, because it was the Vatican helping out this refugee by giving him fake papers. I tried that argument on the Vatican archivists and didn't get very far. Whether or not it'll shed new light on this particular story, probably not that much, but I'm sure it'll shed new light on Vichy's relations with the Vatican. Any other thoughts or comments? I think we're at the top of the hour, so thanks very much.
Thank you very much.